What's up everyone, welcome back to another video. And look, if you want to make the best out of your camera, you should be shooting in a log profile. Now I know that it sounds a little bit scary and overcomplicated, but believe me, that is probably the only way that you will be able to achieve a more precise color correction later on. And also it's probably the only way to allow you to create your own, let's say, creative identity. It will also help you to color match if you're using different cameras, let's say a iPhone or a DJI action cam or even a camera from another brand. So in today's video, let's dive in on how I expose my log footage to make my life better later on when I'm color grading, and also some of the things that I use to help me out to achieve an even better log exposure clip. If you don't know what log is, let me explain. And to put in simple terms, a log footage is a flat looking clip that retains a lot of data because it's not digitally processed by your camera. This setting is not a standard setting in your camera. So if you are a Sony user, for example, you will need to set it up as a S log. If you're a Canon user, then it would be a C log. And if you're a DJI fan, and for all the people that are using more and more DJI products, DJI uses a D log, which is just a DJI log. For my fellow Sony users, go to menu, exposure, color, color tone, picture profile 1, and choose S-Log 3 for gamma and S-Gamma 3 Cine for color mode. So now that you have your camera set up to be shooting in log, there are a few things that you need to consider first. First, you will need an ND filter, and ND filters will help you to keep your shutter speed doubled of your frame rate. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about, I'm referring to the 180-degree rules, meaning that if you're shooting at 25 frames per second or 30 frames per second, your shutter speed should be at 50 or 60. The main reason why ND filters are so important is that because if you're outside, for example, where you cannot have control of your light like I have here in the studio, it will help you to keep that 180-degree rule so you can achieve what they call a cinematic blur, which is just a fancy word to describe our natural motion blur, the things that we see in real life. And that can only be achieved if you are shooting at 25. You maybe can go to 30, but between 25 and 30 is what they call the natural motion blur. Once you put the ND filter in your camera, the easier way to make sure that your footage is well exposed is to rely on the zebra. And the zebra is a function that pretty much every camera has that will tell you which parts of your frame are overexposed. Relying on the zebras will also help you to make sure that you are not losing any detail in your footage. So if you have a brighter image and you overexpose it, you're not going to be retaining any detail. So the zebra will help you to see that. But here though, a quick tip. If you see a lot of zebras in your frame, that doesn't mean that your shot is completely lost. Just think about what you're focusing on. So if you're shooting a person, for example, and you have zebra lines all over the face, then you might be losing some details. But if your zebra line is more on the background or in some parts of the clothing that might be a little bit more overexposed, that doesn't mean that you're losing entirely all the detail in the shot. Because in theory, if you are shooting a person, what you want to have a very well exposed is the face. So as long as the face is not all marked with zebras, you should be good to go. And it's a good maybe starting point to see if your footage is well exposed or not, if you can correct some of the areas that are overexposed. But if you don't, maybe just pay attention to what your focus really is. Another important thing here is don't be afraid to get out of what they call the native ISO. The native ISO are normally 2 ISO values that each camera have, which will give you the least amount of noise possible. But don't be afraid to get out of them, because a lot of people talk about it if you're doing something wrong. Just remember that in the end, what you really want is to expose your photo better. So if you can use it ISO on 800, great. If you can use it at a 400, also great. If you need it to crank up a little bit, also good. So don't be afraid of exploring. And yes, if you are shooting in a low light scenario, most of the time you will need to be introducing external lights, unless you're shooting something that you know that you will need to mainly capture the light parts of the frame and don't bother too much about the darkest. But if you are trying to expose the night scene as you would on a daylight scene, then yes, your increased of ISO will generate noise, which is something that you don't want. But for most of us, in the cases that we use the camera the most, we don't need to worry about it. Something that can also help you to expose your log footage better is to keep an eye on your lighting meter. So it's exposure meter that normally will show you on your screen. And people say that anything between plus 1.7 and 2 is a good value to be in. The problem of that is that even if you follow that rule, sometimes on those values, your footage will be a little bit underexposed. And when you have an underexposed footage, it is very difficult to color grade later on. So when you're shooting S-Log, based on my experience, you always want to overexpose a little bit more without losing any details so you can bring it back down into post later. What I do normally is I make sure that what I'm exposing is correct, as I mentioned before, using the zebras, and as long as I have on my frame what I need to be exposed, then I move on, even if it's 1.7 or if it's 2.0. But most of the time, to be very honest, my exposure meter is blinking +2. So don't really worry too much about it. See what actually works for you, try it out and see where the exposed values are for you. Another tool that most of the cameras have is a gamma assist, which most likely will help you to expose your footage better. Gamma assist pretty much does is convert your log footage to a Rec 709 only on display, so you can see how exposed the areas of your frame are once you convert that S-Log to Rec 709, which is something that when you're shooting in log, you will need to be doing that later in post. When you press the button for gamma assist, it does not actually imprint that Rec 709 to your footage. It's just to visually represent how it would look like when you actually convert later. I'm pretty sure that if you follow those steps, you will be able to take your log footage to a whole new level. But hey, don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to try out new things and see how it turns out. Now, something that I use that helps me a lot is the use of an external monitor. Besides being bigger in size, meaning that you can see more, external monitors have other functions that most cameras don't have. In my case, for example, I use a lot of the Luma waveform as well as my own LUT, so I can see how my footage looks like already when I'm using my own LUT, which, believe me, it helps a lot because you can then fine tune in even more your exposure. So when I'm using an external monitor, which I use is the Portkeys PT5-2, and every time I have it on, I normally have my Luma waveform on so I can actually see the exposure levels, which gives me a better indication than only what I'm seeing on the screen. Now, I'm not going to be too technical and very deep into what a Luma waveform is. If you want to know, let me know in the comments below. But basically, a Luma waveform will give you a value from 0 to 100, where normally a well-exposed footage is sitting between 0 and 100. And if anything in your footage is touching the floor or peaking above 100, it means you have no detail whatsoever, none on the highlights or none of in the shadows. So make sure that when you're exposed, you keep an eye on it and try to keep it in between, not touching the bottom and definitely not peaking above 100. And that is pretty much it. Shooting in log will definitely take your footage to a whole new level, and it will allow you to be more creative because, well, you can edit that yourself. And believe me, that requires practice. Like, shooting in log is not just one-time thing. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. You will fail because it's not a very straightforward science. You need to experiment and see how it works for you in different light scenarios. And the more you practice, the more you do, the easier it gets until you get to the point where you're like, cool, that's very easy. I can do this all day and I love it. So don't rely on your camera auto mode because that is not going to be doing a good job for you. If you do have any questions, please let me know in the comments down below. I want to say thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoy, and please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future videos. I have a shit ton of content coming this year. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.